Bloom's taxonomy is a toolbox that teachers or students can use to classify and organize learning objectives. Its most popular version is based on the cognitive domain and assumes that learning should be structured from easy to difficult in the following 6 steps. 1. Remember. 2. Understand. 3. Apply. 4. Analyze. 5. Evaluate. 6. Create. On the first level, we learn to remember. There is just rote memorization and recollection of facts without much understanding. For example, if we learn about lemons, we want to remember the name, shape, color, size, and that they are sour. Once we memorize these essentially meaningless facts, we move to the second level of learning. On level 2, we learn to understand. We begin to decode information and learn that a lemon is yellow when it's ripe to eat, and if we take a bite, that it's really super sour. We also understand that lemons love sunshine and that they contain lots of vitamin C, which is a great natural antioxidant that keeps us healthy. Now, as we really understand a lemon, we can work with it. On the third level, we apply what we know. We've understood that while lemons are sour, they are also a great provider of vitamin C. To apply this knowledge in a meaningful way, we could boil a lemon into hot water and add some honey. Then serve this hot lemon to our sick sister who's in need of treatment. On the fourth level, we learn to analyze. This involves examining and breaking down information into components, determining how the parts relate to one another, and finding evidence to support generalizations. We study the lemon flesh, examine the skin, and look at levels of vitamins. We conclude that we can eat everything inside, while the skin tastes bitter and contains traces of toxic pesticides. It ought not to be consumed. Now we are ready to evaluate. We analyze, critique, and compare. To evaluate our lemon as a good source of vitamins, we compare it to other sources, such as oranges and supplements. We look at the following properties: vitamin levels, affordability, taste, and packaging waste. If we evaluate our thoughts critically and without bias, we learn where the lemons score high and where others score higher.
Hello everyone, in this video we're going to look at Vygotsky's theory of social development, also called as the sociocultural theory. Now, just like Piaget, the work of Vygotsky has become the foundation of much research and theories in cognitive development over the past several decades, which is one of the reasons why we're looking at it in this video. Now, what was Vygotsky's rationale in developing this theory? He believed that social interaction is a major factor that leads to cognitive development in children. I quote, "Every function in the child's cultural development appears twice, first on the social level and later on the individual level, first between people and then inside the child." This basically means there is a link between communication and internal thought process. This will be explained further through the course of this video. We firstly look at an important concept called elementary mental functions, or EMFs. He believed that infants are born with some mental abilities, or EMFs, like attention, sensation, perception, and memory, which are later developed into higher mental functions. Now, if we look at Vygotsky's theory in a nutshell, it basically is a conversion of EMFs into higher mental functions through social interaction, and these higher mental functions include independent thinking and independent learning. Now let's look at some important principles of Vygotsky's work. What are the foundations upon which Vygotsky laid the theory? The first principle is a concept called a more knowledgeable other, or MKO. The second is the zone of proximal development, or ZPD, and the third is language. So what is the first fundamental principle, which is the more knowledgeable other? So a more knowledgeable other is somebody with a higher mental ability level than the learner. So an MKO can impart knowledge and lead to cognitive development in a child or an infant. It's also important to remember that this doesn't have to be an older adult. It can also be another child, a slightly older child. Now, for instance, if the knowledge imparted it relates to video games, then an older child can be a better MKO than an adult. Now, an MKO can provide behavioral or verbal instructions to the child, which will lead to collaborative dialogue, and this can lead to cognitive development. So you get the concept, I'm sure, about a more knowledgeable other, or an MKO, imparting information to a child, and this leading to cognitive development. In a similar way, there is a concept called a zone of proximal development, ZPD. Before we look at that, we'll look at a very simple example which is very commonly used with this theory. Now, the example entails a child attempting to solve a jigsaw puzzle. The child is attempting to solve a jigsaw puzzle under the supervision of an adult. The child struggles at first to understand where to start and how to proceed. Then the adult provides instructions like start off with looking for corner pieces first, and then start assembling the puzzle through the corner pieces and make your way to the center. Once these instructions are provided, the child finds it easy to solve the jigsaw puzzle under the adult's supervision, and then gradually without the adult being present. So it's a process of learning how to solve a jigsaw puzzle, which now leads to what we call the zone of proximal development. Now, there is a zone of can-dos for a child and a zone of can't-dos for a child, because obviously a child will only gradually learn how to do a lot of things over the course of his or her life. Now, between the zone of can-dos and can't-dos is the zone of proximal development, which is the zone reached because of an input provided by an MKO, or it can be input provided through technological tools as well. Now, because of the input of an MKO, now for instance, in this example that we just used, an adult explaining to the child to start off with the corner pieces and make his or her way to the center has enhanced the can-do zone of the child and made it approach towards the can't-do zone in this particular example. So, with the use of an MKO's knowledge, a child can reach that area or zone of proximal development. That is basically what this concept means. Now, the third important principle of Vygotsky's theory is the use of language, because Vygotsky viewed language to be one of man's greatest tools of cognitive development and not just a means of communication. He believed that language until the age of 2 is just a means of external communication, and then from the age of 3 it becomes a part of private speech, or basically children speak to themselves and try to learn from that process, try to explain things to themselves, and that gradually becomes silent internal speech, which then becomes the child's internal thought process. So he basically viewed language as a tool, as one of the greatest tools of development, of cognitive development in a child. So the three important tools or principles are the MKO, a zone of proximal development, ZPD, and language.
Finally, there are closed captions to help you with the English if you need them. Let's get started. We need to have some objectives for each lesson in the course. By the end of this chapter, and hopefully with the help of this video, you should have a decent understanding of why you want to be a language teacher, the basic flow of a language class, and what points are important to consider when observing a class. Make sure you keep these in mind as you go through the chapter. These are the topics we are going to cover in this chapter. It is pretty simple, so I'm going to be adding a little extra to the side. Make sure you read the chapter carefully and watch this video to fully prepare for class. Can you remember when you first decided that you wanted to become a teacher? How about that you wanted to be a language teacher? I remember being in grade 2 of elementary school, and I was teaching a grade 1 student some spelling. When that grade 1 student understood the spelling, I understood the feeling of someone learning a new thing because of me. There are plenty of reasons to become a language teacher. Maybe you enjoy the challenges that come with teaching, or perhaps you see teaching as a lifelong learning experience. You might simply enjoy languages and want to pass that knowledge on to others. Or, like me, the feeling of accomplishment that comes with teaching might be what called you. For our first discussion, I'd like you to talk about the reasons why you decided to become a language teacher. If you can, tell a story that includes the moment you decided that you wanted to be a teacher. It's through telling stories that we pass on knowledge and feelings to others. Be prepared with your stories to share with others in class. I'd like to follow the first discussion topic with another one about your experiences with teaching as a student. I imagine you have had many teachers in the past. Tell your experiences with good and, if you like, not so good teachers. On pages 3 to 8 of our textbook, we see a description of a lesson taught in Korea. I'd like you to read through the description of the lesson so you'll get a basic idea of the structure. Although it is not mentioned in the textbook, this lesson follows a PPP design. The PPP structure of a lesson is a very popular way of teaching. First, we have present. Here, the teacher introduces the topic and/or grammar point of the lesson for that day. Then we have practice. This is when students are given chances to practice. This might include repeating after the teacher, reading aloud, or doing drills. Finally, we have produce. It is at this stage when students are given the opportunity to produce their own English sentences or conversations while using the main topic or grammar point of the lesson. As you read through the lesson description, think about where each P of the PPP structure fits into the lesson. What do you think of the PPP structure? Some people dislike it, whereas others swear by it. I would like you to critically analyze the PPP structure, and we will have a discussion about this in class. When I say critically analyze it, I mean think about the strengths and weaknesses of this lesson structure. Then, decide whether you would like to use it in your own classes. If you prepare for this, with some examples of course, we can have some good discussions in class. I don't want to get into this too much here, but personally, I don't mind the PPP structure. However, I would like to add an extra P at the beginning, kind of like PPPP, or 4P, I guess. I would like to see production 1 at the beginning, then production 2, which is a slightly more advanced version of the first production task, at the end. This way, the teachers can get an idea of how much students already know about the topic and/or grammar point, as well as get a clear idea of what points students already understand well, thus need little explanation in the presentation stage, and those points students don't understand well. This way, the teacher can provide a little more personalized coaching for the students.
Piaget's theory of cognitive development It is a very important step in understanding child psychology because it explains how a child constructs a mental model of the world he or she is living in. Why is there a need for Piaget's theory? Why was there a need for Piaget's theory back in 1936? There was a need because children were actually looked at as they were miniature version of adults, and therefore it was difficult to understand how a child actually looked at the world around him or her. Piaget's theory emphasized that children don't actually start learning and perceiving things as adults. They aren't actually smaller version of adults, and they go through 4 specific stages of mental development and gradually develop mental abilities and eventually start looking at the world around us in the same way as adults do. So let's take a look at the stages of cognitive development. It's important to note that these stages here are arranged in the form of an arrow. It could very easily have been arranged as stairs or steps, because there's no concrete way of arranging these 4 stages. They just happen one after the other, as is evident from the picture. So the first stage that a child goes through is sensory motor, which happens between 0 to 2 years, and then there's the pre-operational stage, which happens between 2 to 7 years, and then there is a concrete operational stage, which happens between 7 and 11 years, and then there is a formal operational stage, which happens after year 12. So let's look at these stages one after the other. The first stage is the sensory motor stage, which happens between 0 and 2 years. So a good way of remembering this stage is firstly picture a child of 0 to 2 years in your mind and understand that the child would actually look at things just with the view of holding them, just looking at them and putting them in their mouth. That's what children do. And these are basically motor senses, which are sight, sound, touch, smell, taste, etc. Basic motor senses, and that's all the child actually realizes to use at this stage. So sensory refers to motor senses, and this is the stage where all of the sensory motor skills, senses are used by the child to explore the world around him or her. So children in this stage realize that they are different to the inanimate objects around them, gradually of course, not when a child is a few months old, but gradually in this stage they realize that they are actually different. They have an individual existence. They start learning, this is very important, they start learning that things can exist even if they don't see them, which is called object permanence. This is a very important concept because this is one of the most important developments that happen in this stage. Object permanence basically refers to the notion that an object will still exist if it's not present in front of their eyes. For instance, if it's a very young child who requires a certain type of ball, and if it's taken away from him and put away in a place where he or she can't see it, then he or she would think that the object no longer exists. But gradually, as the child progresses along in this stage, he or she realizes that the object still exists, but it's just away from his eyesight, from his field of vision. So that is called object permanence, and that is developed in this stage. They also learn to start experimenting with trial and error to get attention. So this is something that anyone who has experienced life living with a toddler would understand, that they start experimenting, they start analyzing, observing patterns wherein their demands are met once a certain behavioral pattern is followed. So they would continue following these behavior patterns to get their demands met at this stage. Piaget actually divided this stage into various sub-stages, which which actually explain the same thing in greater detail, so we're not going to go into those sub-stages of this video. We're going to move on to the next stage, which is the pre-operational stage, which is from 2 to 7 years. The hallmark, the primary development in this stage is language. Children now also start using words and pictures to represent objects. For instance, they understand that dressing up as a doctor, they can see the world as a doctor, so they understand role play. They understand that certain pictures and words can actually represent objects. Children start to think about themselves more, and basically at some point think about themselves as being the center of the universe, which Piaget coined a word for called egocentric. So Piaget believed that children at this stage become very egocentric, and they rarely understand things from another person's point of view. For instance, a good example is if a child is watching TV with you, he or she would stand right in front of you at times and watch the TV and would not understand that he or she is actually blocking your view of the television. So long as the child can see it, they believe that it's visible for absolutely everybody. So that is just a one view of the world, and that's their own at this stage. So moving on to the next stage, which is called concrete operational, which goes on from 7 to 11 years. The main aspect of this stage is the development of logical reasoning. So through the course of this stage, logical reasoning is developed in the minds of the child. Instead of being egocentric, they are now sociocentric, wherein they actually observe other people's viewpoints and actually understand most of them and the differences between their viewpoints and the viewpoints of others. Another important concept here is conservation. So basically, if a child in the pre-operational stage gets an object broken into several pieces, like a piece of candy, he or she wouldn't understand that some of these pieces would actually still be the same.
Noam Chomsky's theory of language. First, a bit about the theorist himself. Noam Chomsky is an American philosopher, theorist, cognitive scientist, and linguist. Chomsky was born in 1928 and is currently 86 years old. He is widely known for his role in both linguistics as well as political activism. Chomsky describes the study of cognitive linguistics as the study of the language faculty of the human mind. The theory. Chomsky's theory is based on the idea that all children are born with the innate ability to learn any human language. Based on Chomsky's theory, all children have an LAD, otherwise known as a language acquisition device. The LAD's job is to encode into a child's brain the major principles of language and grammatical structure of the language. According to Chomsky, a theory of language should be known as a theory of competence. He believes once a full theory of competence is developed, then other cognitive abilities and performance will be integrated. Factors in his theory. First, he believes that all children have an optimal learning age. Between the ages of 3 and 10 is when children will learn to talk in its entirety and they will grasp fluency. Second, children do not need a trigger to learn a language. Language comes naturally. Parents do not need to coax their child to speak. Simply speaking around the child will help the child to produce a language on their own. Third, even if a child is corrected, they will still speak in the same way they spoke before they were corrected. My thoughts. After learning about Noam Chomsky's theory, I've come to several different conclusions. I do not agree with his theory in its entirety. I do believe there is an optimal age from which a child will learn language. I also agree with his theory in the sense that most children have an innate ability to learn any language. What I do not agree with him about is that children understand grammatical errors without being taught, and that children cannot be corrected in their speech. If children understood grammar and were never able to be corrected in their speech, teachers would never teach students language arts and writing skills. Conclusion. In conclusion, Noam Chomsky has been a huge help in developing a theory on linguistics and language development in children. Children have a born ability to learn any human language, and Chomsky demonstrates that in his theory of language development.
To focus on the theories, methods and techniques of teaching. And we're going to start with a quote. This is an interesting quotation because it contains within it a philosophical argument. And it's a philosophical argument of the way in which we learn. Basically, this one is saying that the intelligence of their own children comes about due to a natural process. So this one could be said to be due to nature. This is exactly the opposite of this one, which is saying that their teaching, the environment that we create, creates that intelligence. So this one can be said to be due to nurture. And this argument, nature versus nurture, has been going on for thousands of years. These two viewpoints are two ends of a scale, or a continuum if you like, and every teaching methodology that's ever been created has its starting point somewhere on this scale. For example, if a particular methodology has its starting point here, then that would be 50% due to nature and 50% is due to nurture. Before looking at the methods or approaches themselves, there are some terms that we need to define. These are the approach, the method, or the technique. Basically, these are hierarchical. The approach is an overriding set of principles that a method can actually make use of, whereas the technique are the things that we actually do in the classroom to approach that method. So these three words are going to appear during the presentation. Again, for each of either the approaches or the methodologies, we're going to ask 4 questions. So be it an approach or a method, for each of those things, where did it come from? What's its background? What does it involve when we're talking about actually in the classroom, in other words, techniques? What is positive about it? What appears to work about that methodology or approach? And what is negative? What doesn't work so well? Basically, we're going to look at it in a historical viewpoint. So we'll start with the oldest particular teaching methodology, which is known as the classical method. The classical method was given its name basically because it was trying to teach the classics in language, which is ancient Greek and Latin. Those particular languages are now dead. This methodology was probably started somewhere around the 17th century. And the purpose of this particular methodology was for scholars to be able to translate old Greek and Latin texts into their particular language. If we take the language that we usually speak, our native language, that is often given the designation L1. And the language that we are trying to translate that to, let's call it the target language, is given the designation L2. The purpose of grammar translation then is to basically translate between L1 and L2 and vice versa. So we could take a simple example. Let's imagine that our native language was English and our target language was French. And let's assume that we want to translate a document from French into English. Let's take a simple sentence. Here's a sentence in French. Ouvre la fenêtre, and we'll add s'il vous plaît at the end. What we want to do is to take this L2 and translate it back into English. Now, if we have a reasonable knowledge of French, then we may well know that this particular verb, ouvre, to open, translates directly. And this female form of the, and finally the fenêtre, open the window, and this polite form of please. This is all very well if the two structures that we're translating between, the L1 and the L2, have a common grammar, which French and English usually do. However, one problem that we do get with this particular classical method is that if the grammar structures are not the same, then it's very difficult to translate between the two things. Okay, and so if we look at the first question, where did it come from? Basically, around the 17th century, it was used by scholars to translate ancient Greek and Latin texts into their native language. The whole idea of grammar translation was therefore based on being able to read and write in that particular language. This methodology was never intended for the learning of speaking. Now, it's very strange that this particular method is actually the most popular method for the teaching of languages throughout the world. And we've just said that that does not involve speaking skills. So one of the main problems with the classical method or grammar translation is that it does not develop speaking skills. What does it involve? It involves taking the native language and converting it to Greek or Latin or vice versa. What's positive about it? Well, it is the most popular method for teaching language. And if your language structures, the grammars that you're working between are similar, then it allows you to infer from the context of a particular sentence what something might actually mean. If we think back to the example that we translated at the beginning, which was ouvre la fenêtre, let's say, for example, that you had never seen the word fenêtre in French before and that you didn't know what it was. You could, from a very good knowledge of English, actually infer what that meant. We have ouvre, which means to open, la, which is the, so we know we're going to open something. And if you have a very good native language knowledge in terms of vocabulary, you may know the English word defenestration. And defenestration is the act of being thrown out of a window. So this has a similar root to fenêtre in French. So you may well be able to infer what that particular sentence means. In terms of the things that are negative about it, we've already said that it doesn't develop speaking, but perhaps the biggest negative point about this particular methodology is that it's very unnatural. Okay, so despite the criticisms of this particular method, and particularly the fact that it's unnatural, this particular methodology was in use all the way through the 17th, 18th and 19th century, and indeed it's still in use today. However, Guan in the 1880s and Berlitz in the early 1900s decided that this particular methodology was so unnatural that they wanted to come up with something new. The method that they came up with, they called the direct method. You will also sometimes see it as the natural method. What these two people were saying is that if we wish to learn a language, then we should try to recreate the conditions that we learn our native language in. And this is what the natural methodology tried to do. So what we're going to do is to run through a series of methodologies that were created mainly in the 1900s that adopted the idea that language learning should be much more communicative, much more natural.
Hello. Today I'd like to talk about listening comprehension, something that you're doing right now. How does comprehension work? It's a very complex process, but researchers have identified two different strands, you might say, of listening that are important to think about. One is called bottom-up processing and the other is called top-down processing. Bottom-up processing is the traditional view of comprehension. It says when we try to understand something, either something in print or something we're listening to, we have to work through language. We work at the level of the word and the sentence, and then we extract the meaning from it. So we start from the bottom, which is the actual language we hear, and we analyze it, if you like, mentally, and then we arrive at the top, which is the meaning. For that reason, it's called bottom-up processing. Bottom-up processing suggests that the meaning is contained in the words that we hear or see. The meaning and the message are all contained in the language that we hear. However, there's another form of processing that's involved when we engage in comprehension, and that's called top-down processing. And top-down processing suggests that we start from meaning and then work towards language. What does that mean? Well, it means that we bring to comprehension background knowledge, ideas, information, expectations, and we use this as we listen, and that enables us to, if you like, bypass some of the bottom-up processing we might normally be engaged in. For example, supposing I tell you I'm going to tell you something about an earthquake. Immediately you activate knowledge that you have about this topic. Where did it happen? How many people were injured? What is being done about it? And so on. That generates a set of questions that you will use to process the information I give you about the earthquake. This is an example of top-down processing. It's using background knowledge as a basis for mapping what we know against what we hear and arriving at a meaning of the message. So the two go side by side, if you like, bottom up and top down. The more we know about a topic, the more background knowledge we're able to access, the more top-down processing we're able to make use of. The less we know about a topic, the more language-based processing we will have to make use of. So when we're teaching students to read or to listen, we often have to look at a text and ask, will the students be able to process this using background knowledge, or will they have to be given some help in accessing this text, some pre-listening, some pre-reading activities that will activate the knowledge and information that may be relevant to understanding that topic. A related concept is the concept of schema. A schema refers to the body of knowledge that you bring to bear on a particular topic or a situation. For example, if I mention a supermarket, you think of a physical context. You think of people there for a particular purpose, doing things, using procedures and artifacts and so on to achieve their goals. This is all part of the schema, if you like, of the supermarket. Again, I mentioned the earthquake and the information you bring to bear on that particular topic. So in real-world comprehension, we access hundreds of schemas of this kind which enable us to process language simply and effectively. And it's because we're making use of these schemas that speakers don't need to spell out everything that they could say about a topic, because they assume that the listener will be accessing that topic and filling out the details herself or himself. So comprehension then is a process that draws on both language-based processing as well as meaning-based processing. Bottom-up and top-down, they go hand in hand. And when we're teaching comprehension, we need to be sure that we're not just teaching bottom-up processing, language-based processing. We're not just working at the level of words and sentences. We're also activating background knowledge and encouraging students to make predictions, to guess what's coming, to draw on their knowledge of the world, to enable them to listen the way people do in authentic listening situations.